Welcome back to the last session of today's very, very fruitful presentations and discussions. I wish we can go on all night, but we can't. And at some point, one has to sort of, take a little bit of a break and think about the ramifications of the ideas that have been explored all through the day. And the last session, which I will be handing over to Alison Thompson, will certainly bring to a productive conclusion in terms of how art negotiates the peculiarities, the specificities, and the particularities of the subject of the Black Atlantic. I think that, Courtney Martin's presentation in the last session and Isaac's presentation, kind of open up, even more space, to think about some of these issues, especially in light of the relationship between Faris Thompson's notion of the, Black Atlantic metrics and Paul Gilroy's relationship to the idea of the Black Atlantic and double consciousness, between what one may consider the transnational aspect of the Black Atlantic and the diasporic aspect of the Black Atlantic. I think these are very important questions that we need to tease out, and I believe that that Helen Gallagher's work will help us kind of open up, that space, and of course Sonia Boyce's, reflection. But so, without much further ado, I would like to really thank the participants and the moderators, for making the journey here and for giving us, such an opportunity to engage with these ongoing discussions that remain unfinished. So please help me welcome Alison Thompson.
Good afternoon, everybody. The late afternoon sessions are always for the strong constitution. So thank you for staying, and you won't be disappointed. We have two really wonderful artists who are going to be speaking to us in the session. I wanted to first of all thank Akwi for including me in today's panel. It's really a great pleasure to be here. And I wanted to congratulate Akwi and his entire team here at Haus der Kunst on the Frank Bowling exhibition. It is really such a wonderful show. Great to see these paintings. If ever there was work that you had to see in the flesh, this is that work. And to see it in these galleries with the high ceilings and all of the space and the volume of work, it really does feel like a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. So I'm very, very glad to be here. A lot of times today, with the reflection on the ideas that were being discussed, I was wishing that I was sitting in the galleries. I somehow felt that if I could absorb these ideas while I was actually absorbing the works, that somehow it would bring me to some kind of more insightful understanding of the ideas. And so I think I'm going to have to come back tomorrow or the next day and sit there and go through those notes again and kind of hope that I gain some new enlightenment. Which brings me to the title of today's session, Traveling Light. And my job is to introduce the speakers. And I will tell you, I was sitting there at lunch and I was saying, oh my gosh, I haven't read through the bios yet. I need to be a good moderator and read the bios. And my colleagues were saying, well, that's ridiculous, Sonia and Ellen. And those bios are so boring. Those weren't my words, that's what they said. So I thought that I would give you my perspective on how I came to know these two artists, because that's what came to me. I was reminded of that in this morning's session when David Scott was talking about Stuart Hall and coming to an understanding of Stuart Hall while thinking about his Jamaicanness. And that's how I came to know Sonia about 20 years ago. I had just finished writing a book, Art in Barbados, with my colleague Alessandra Cummins. And Verla Poupée, who is the director of the National Gallery in Jamaica now, reviewed the book. And she had just finished writing her book on Caribbean art. And her comment was, as nice as it was to read about those artists, it was too confined in its concept of art in Barbados, because it did not think about the wider diaspora. We didn't think about artists like Sonia Boyce. And I actually did not know the work of Sonia Boyce 20 years ago. And when I had the opportunity to give a talk somewhere on women artists from Barbados, I thought now is the opportunity for me to reach out. And I did. And I spoke about what it would mean to think about Sonia's work from the perspective of a Caribbean artist. And I think 20 years ago, maybe she wasn't really kind of thought in that context. But not only what would it mean to an understanding of Sonia's work, but what would it mean to an understanding of Caribbean art and Barbadian art to include Sonia and the artists from the diaspora as part of that discussion. Because 20 years ago, we weren't really thinking about diaspora as part of that nationalist story. Of course, it's not just Barbadian art, it's also Guyanese art. The story of Guyana is also part of Sonia's story, which provides this nice link to Frank Bowling today. They have a number of kind of synergies between the two of them. Included in the exhibition is the first work by a black artist acquired by Tate Britain, which was Frank's work. And 2 weeks later, the second work was a work by Sonia. They have both received a number of national honors, are both Royal Academicians. And I think the other thing that's interesting to think about in terms of what Sonia brings to the discussion of Frank Bowling's work is the really pivotal work she's doing on modernism, which has come up in the discussion today, as the lead investigator on the BAM project, Black Artists and Modernism. The other thing I'll just say quickly, since again David opened, or maybe Akwi opened the door to, or somebody did, advertising. I'll just hold this up. This just came out last week. And it is a book that looks at Sonia's wonderful work on collaborative performance. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to Sonia.
Okay, I'm going to maybe ask that the film starts. This is a bit of an experiment, so hopefully you'll bear with me. Of course, first of all, I'd like to thank Akwi and Andrea. Andrea, a bit of a superhero here. The whole team here at Haus der Kunst for inviting me to this symposium. I have to say I'm a little bit daunted, but I'm really thrilled to be amongst such esteemed company and the rich conversations that we've already heard today. So, I think the film will begin at any moment. Yeah. So what I'm going to try to do today is twofold. As so much of Frank Bowling's practice is situated in the field and activity of modernist painting, I want to approach it looking at his work from the pragmatics of painting via inquiries into the substrate. I also want to discuss, if I may, the effects of this activity in the more symbolic aura of the work. To begin with, I'd like to situate myself in the moment when I entered Discourses on Visual Arts Practice. At the end of the 1970s, when I was an art student, there were several heated debates about the status of painting, particularly coming from a feminist critique. Painting within critical art practice had become discredited, over-bloated with a sense of its own exclusionary importance. And for many entering the debate, painting represented a massive obstacle. A bit like the terror of the blank page for a writer. In painting, one had to tussle with a kind of beforehand, a priori, one might say, with the weight of Western art history. To approach the bare canvas, therefore, was to knowingly enter into the gladiatorial space of the artistic canon. One can, at a certain level, at a symbolic level, think of the substrate, this bare canvas, the material surface upon which the artwork is applied and lives as an organism, something that some call the support, as a social ground of authority that is invoked by the field of painting. I think I was always a bit too intimidated to take on this hierarchical amphitheatre. Frank evidently felt no such qualms, albeit someone of an earlier generation. He jumped right in fearlessly. I first came to know about Frank Bowling when soon after leaving art school in the mid-1980s, I was summoned by the director of the Arts Council of Great Britain, as it was then called, by the wonderful and formidable Joanna Drew. Actually, I had met Frank before, or I'd been in the same space as him before, and it was mentioned earlier by Courtney, the 1982 Wolverhampton Black Art Convention, and we were both at the same conference, but I didn't know who he was, and therefore I didn't really go up to him and speak to him. But anyway, back to this meeting I had with Joanna, where she invited me, well actually it was less of an invitation and more of a demand, that I join the Arts Council's purchasing panel, responsible for acquiring contemporary artworks for the National Collection. I was in my mid-20s, part of the burgeoning black British art scene, and a bit wet behind the ears. One of the many artist studio visits took us to the studio of Frank Bowling. I was astonished, having never been introduced to his work before then. At that time, Frank was in the midst of painting his Great Thames series, one of which the Arts Council subsequently bought. Engulfed as I was in the presence of these monumental works close up in his studio, their sheer tactile presence overwhelmed me. I felt there was something squalid and churning on top and beneath the surface. I was immediately reminded of another British painter, Terry Setch. Afterwards, much later, I could see a link going back to Turner and his infamous slave ship painting of 1840. Originally titled Slaves Throwing Overboard the Dead and the Dying, Typhoon Coming On, Turner, an anti-slavery supporter, was influenced by newspaper accounts and the subsequent court case about the slave ship Zong, where in 1781 the captain of the ship ordered 133 slaves to be thrown overboard so that he could claim the insurance. Turner is often cited as a major influence, a father figure, one might say, in relation to expressionism and in particular abstract expressionism, with the exaggerated presence of his painterly gesture. The qualities of painting are often praised for its ability to create illusion, to master and control composition, to depict. And it was great to hear earlier today from the film of Frank speaking about the job of a painter is to organise through geometry the rectangular space of the canvas. However, later I suggest that he lets go of that demand of that rigid system of geometry, the compositional mode, for a desire to compose the visual world of the canvas comes into tension, I would say, with the substrate, the ground that he's working on. As another British painter, much younger, Dan Sturgis has written in his essay, Substrate, Leaning Against the Medium. When speaking about the material considerations that artists are drawn to, it is important to remember the intertwining of the physical properties of a material and the theoretical ideas held in it, and its specific present and past use. Just possibly the idea of the substrate might enable this collision between the material and the conceptual. And here I suppose I want to kind of help us think about how the past and the present, and a kind of genealogy, you could say, of painting operates within Frank Bowling's work, and I'm making this connection with Turner. Ever since the first encounter with Frank's Great Thames series, I've been more drawn to the paintings that let go of the graphic signage of geography, of maps, the hieroglyphics of a specific place, to those works that seem to embody the vast expanse of the visual field without a pictorial handrail. Here, in this murkier realm, Frank has jumped into the vast conceptual space that the work refers to, working out their dynamics in the processes he employs, rather than trying to pictorialise them. The cantankerous and recently deceased art critic Brian Sewell classified Frank's Great Thames paintings as a dirty palette version of Monet's Water Lilies. Whilst obviously meant as an insult, despite Sewell's dismissive tone, for me it sheds light on a counter-narrative about jostling and finding a place, seemingly amongst modernism's canonical figures. Sewell draws attention to bowling's seemingly out-of-placeness, the muddying of the water, so to speak, that Frank as a black figure represents. In this move from depicting the geographical expanse to manifesting its presence through drips and splashes, spreading thick substances, scraping and soaking wet materials, brushwork and pushing against the grain, the substrate shifts from the support for applied painterly gestures to the site, the stage of enactment. Again, referring to the short film shown earlier with Frank in conversation with Ockwee, he suggests that this shift is one of letting go, letting the medium pool or drift like continental drift. We are, of course, familiar with the likes of Jackson Pollock as a performative painter. Frank's later works have to be seen within this context. However, these very pragmatic processes of painting, for me, operate as a doorway into another sphere, the underworld, a fantastical, if troubling and dark space opens up. During the 1980s, like many of my friends, I was consumed by the writings of many African-American female writers, and for some reason I always made a connection between Frank Bowling's waterlogged paintings and The Salt Eaters by Tony K. Bambara. Maybe I'm connecting the question of salt and its relation to the sea. The Salt Eaters is not an easy read. Bambara's characters inhabit non-linear space-time continuum. There are equivalents to be drawn between the mysterious presences in the Salt Eaters to these latter oceanic seabed paintings of Frank's, a proposition about time, ghosts, and aura. The inside of the Salt Eaters book cover reads, "Set in Claiborne, a small town somewhere in the southern states of America, the Salt Eaters is a story of a community of black faith healers who, searching for the healing powers of salt, witness an event." The event, I would like to suggest, that Frank asks us to contemplate through the processes of layering is deep time and the literal scale of vastness. Events that have been covered, lost to time, that are beyond our capacity to recapture. Or to concretely decipher. I often wonder what some of the elements are that are sandwiched underneath the layers of his paintings. Throughout the book, it wavers on the cusp in that foggy realm between worlds. It may not come as a surprise then when I say that I get a very similar sense of aura in the presence of Helen Gallagher's work, that sense of another worldliness. Philoctetes' Bow, Frank's title, also invokes a sense of the spiritual yet painful demi-world of Greek mythology. Typically, as with other underworld narratives, it is a place, a location, where the souls of the departed, or those on the verge, meet. Encountering these paintings is like experiencing the mysteries of the tide, of the deep ocean bed, the seabed, the riverbed, pond life, pull back to reveal the dredged-up detritus of the life below. This conjuring is for me a hot mess of painterly bricolage, to quote back from Isaac, of intense and sometimes surprising colours. As he says, his training was about the science and geometry of colour. Plus the physicality of protrusions and dribbles and entanglements, of scrapings and thick gooey plastering, of pooling and pouring and silting and letting go of rigidity. The imprint of a coffee cup, or maybe it's a tin can possibly used to mix his paint, trespasses the canvas surface, leaving its insolent mark, as the composition has a fight with the anarchic gestures, the residue of the artist's actions. Everything is everywhere and palpable. The weight of materiality that these paintings carry collides with the weight of history. It is deceptive these works being shown here at the Haus der Kunst, a cavernous and monumental building. Up close to these paintings, particularly when one is in a more modestly scaled space, it's difficult to comprehend the edges of the paintings. They're meant to be just beyond human perceptibility, beyond the scale of human dimensions. And I just wanted to say very lastly a little bit about Greenberg and Michael Fried and the sense of the question about objecthood and of course of late modernism and this idea that somehow the painting would be in the here and now. And I think that somehow there is a departure that Frank makes beyond the didactics of a kind of Greenbergian theory, that these later works transport us beyond the here and now to a kind of subaltern time. Thank you very much.
I now want to introduce Helen Gallagher. I first met Ellen actually a year ago in Barbados. Ellen had come with a group from the International Curators Forum, and she came to the Barbados Community College where I work and did a wonderful session with our students. And then the entire group got on a plane and we went to Martinique. And again, I was thinking today how relevant that is to our discussion today. And sort of looking down at your name listed here for this panel, Ellen Gallagher, artist, Rotterdam and New York. And this idea that, how many of us, don't just come from one place, but sort of feel our allegiances to multiple places. And the relevance to the earlier discussion today about the English-speaking Caribbean and the French-speaking Caribbean, and that opportunity to move with you between these two spaces and to go into the artist studios and to talk to them and to kind of think about the difference in the infrastructure of those spaces, which speak back to that colonial history that still kind of structures how those artists continue to function. And then I saw Ellen again in May in Venice. She is part of the Diaspora Pavilion, as is Isaac Julian. And the work that she has there, for me, is very evocative of Frank's work, with that kind of layering of rich, liquid color and the evocation of the sea, but also the layers and the complexity of history that speak to this idea of the sea as history. And so with further ado, I'll let Ellen come and speak to us.
So yes, thank you, Allison, and thank you, Sonia. You're actually, I think, why I'm here. We met here a few years ago in Munich, and because of you, I think I got invited to go to Martinique, where I haven't been for 20 years, so that was incredible. It was an important return for me, so thank you for keeping me part of you. And thank you, Okui and Andrea, and everybody at Haus der Kunst. I'm starting my talk with a painting from Mel Edwards Decides. It's already been talked about today, but 1968. And I wanted to start with this painting because it's such an incredible and seminal painting for me. But for me, it's also about this concrete liquid oscillation that I'm really struck by in Frank Bolling's work. I see it for me as a kind of figuring, not so much between figure and abstraction, but the relentless insertion of matter into the liquid plane. This matter is the liquid plane as much as the vapors and pools that drift across the picture plane, the repeating line of South America, as if the arc of the archipelago has been laid out flat in the mind space of a map. For what is an arc but a series of points making a curve? South America rolled out, repeating flat and in time. The artist's name in block print stenciled and floating just above. Even the title, another directional fragment onto and into the picture plane. If not a literal collage contaminant, still a concrete insertion of a fragment in geographies. This reckoning between concrete fragment and liquid plane is always multi-directional and three-dimensional with Frank. Because as a sailor, Frank Bowling knows we take our geographies with us, that our geographies live inside us. The next image is an image of coral spawn. So you have to bear with me here. I'm taking a leap. I'm not an art historian. Sequence to the moon. This is an annual occurrence scientists are only just now becoming aware of. And this is a wild event. It's about the sex life of coral, where coral release their gametes and freed into the water column, the eggs and sperm float upwards and merge together close to the surface, turning the surrounding waters into a frothing mist of diaphanous and lurid color, which contains millions of coral embryo. These drifting young can ride the currents for hundreds of miles and then descend to form new colonies and reefs. We cannot predict coral spawn, but only register that it happens. This frenzied synchronization between corals in relation to the moon is called broadcast spawning. It is as urgent as it is unknowable to us at this moment in our evolution. This made me think on the surface of Bowling's Mappa Mundi paintings, but it also seems to bring up the prescience of great artists, that ability to predict our future capacities for knowledge. The Mappa Mundi catalog writes about the gnarled innards of Bowling's practice, and further, O'Quee writes, in the New World, between the Caribbean and South America, Black populations have an intimate, subterranean knowledge of the open indigo green sea. Even to itself, the sea is more than nature. This is Saba, a Dutch Caribbean island, where I visited 20 years ago as a student on a sailboat out of Woods Hole, Massachusetts, Saba and Bonaire, and then continuing to Martinique and Roatan, and then up to Miami. I was thinking about my recent visits back to the Caribbean and the ways César's Pan-Africanist Pensée Archipelago does and does not take form, or the way the promise of porosity in Maurice Condé's figuring of scent, her permeable borders of scent, flowers, embalming fluids, does and does not keep us. This is an image of the Dutch island sabre that sits at the edge of the archipelago close by Bonaire. At the edge of the Caribbean, in some ways, Saba is the most isolated from the archipelago, although degrees of isolation from each other seem to remain a defining characteristic of the Caribbean archipelago. Surprising borders remain in place, what might be seen as colonial ghost lines. But strangely, these ghost lines are not one-directional and can become cultural highways. Recently, Saba, an almost forgotten fragment of the Dutch Empire, voted to join the Dutch public body. Suddenly, an island few people heard of in the Netherlands has become the highest point in the Netherlands, replacing Maastricht with this distinction. It was as if this mountain peak rose out of thin air to anchor, like the Dutch to their own history, like a magnet, pulling the lowlands further out to sea. We climbed up the peak, and wandering in the volcanic paths, we came across these old radio towers that had been flown up by helicopter to replace the radio beacons left up there from World War II. Even still today, St. Lucia has radio lines from the Second World War coursing through her peaks. During the wars of the archipelago was used as radio points, listening stations. In May 1940, the city of Rotterdam was entirely destroyed by the Luftwaffe. In a single night, 250 streets were decimated. 1,000 people were killed, and 80,000 people were made homeless. The years that followed saw a constant rebuilding and remaking of the city. So unlike the city centers of Amsterdam or Paris, Rotterdam Center is black and brown. It is a working class port town where the center looks more like Queens than a European city. It is a fluid center, always in flux, always under construction, a black and tan fantasy. I wanted to make a portrait somehow of this powerful energy that seems to emanate from the devastating plane of destruction. Made with thick cut rubber, the paintings are formed in slabs and layered with magazine fragments, concrete ephemera and rubbery incisions, both open and elastic. They build out, but they also fall in like a Petri dish. I was interested in painting whose being and meaning could be about relation and not naming through the outer contours. For me, the phenomena, which this painting is named after, Capsule On, seems fecund with potential. Capsule On is a dish that was created when a Rotterdam-based Cape Verdean hairdresser went into a shawarma shop and made a food collage out of a shawarma dish. Then he really got a taste for it. Capsule On became his standing lunch order. Capsule On is essentially shawarma, fries, Dutch cheese, lettuce, mayonnaise, sambal sauce, spice, and salad dressing, all layered into a segmented tin takeaway container. It's become the most widely recognized Dutch nouveau cuisine. I like the idea of all these ingredients gone fluid in a tin takeout container. In these divisive times, black and brown men in Rotterdam have created this relational space together. It is also about accepting somebody coming in, adopting and transforming your thing, and turning it into something that is now what I consider to be the Dutch national dish. In a country with a very specific ambivalence towards black being, this porosity between black and brown bodies in the heart of Rotterdam is a big part of why I think Rotterdam is thriving. There's also this very salty vernacular that comes out of Rotterdam because it's a sailor town. When the new central station was recently completed, the people named it Station Capsule On. That's what you're looking at now. This is a Rotterdam public tradition, almost like a spontaneous naming competition of who comes up with the best vernacular for city structures. This 3D vernacular is, I think, living matter. This is a little painting I made up of several magazine pages, glued together, shut, and then cut and turned out, like the effects from the advertisement, a kind of hallucination or a kind of inebriation. Carving, engraving, this two-sidedness is also, for me, interesting in terms of my series, Water Ecstatic, which is based on the idea of the deathscape of the Middle Passage, but also the idea of a kind of jump space, an inability to return, but also this continual kind of returning. And I think that Drexcia, as the band, was really important for me from 1997, where they made their manifesto that so greatly moved me, manifesto. And they believe themselves to be channeling oral, A-U-R-A-L, hallucinations from the Middle Passage. But they also, their vinyl, I see their project also as a kind of mapping project, and also as it's a kind of an etching project, not just literally the sound, capturing the sound in this sort of black vinyl etch and groove, but literally they actually created carvings into their vinyl so that as you were listening to a song, you would end up on the other side. So this sort of front and backwards space happening at the same time is a big part of their not just their music, but their whole concept. And actually, this painting is a painting I was just working on, and it's actually named after, it's named from the the galaxy that Drexia has claimed, which is a real thing. They've actually gone and bought a star and claimed this for themselves. And these characters coming back for me are about this jump space, like some reverse Chris Marker where the statues come back to life, are reanimated. This is another recent painting based on whale fall. Whale fall is when a whale, an adult whale, dies and falls to the bottom of the sea and becomes a kind of life source for other organisms as it's picked. And it's something that's only been discovered fairly recently in the 2000s, since 2002, and then again in 2010. And these fissures that exist sort of below light level that create this other life form, these squat worms and crabs and creatures that don't need light, that exist below the sea, that exist as volcanic vents creating secret life that I feel like we haven't even begun to know. Thank you.
Sonia and Ellen, thank you both for two very thought-provoking presentations. Sonia, can I start with you maybe with the first question? And it was about your presentation. And I know I wasn't the only person who was trying very hard to focus at the words while there was this presentation, an alternate presentation, a related but an alternate presentation competing for our attention behind. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about what you were doing.
Okay, and I was purposely not reading where things were on the film because I would have been distracted. But I suppose I was trying to do an experiment of how to express what a double consciousness might be. That one's having to do two different things at the same time, yet get both and find somehow a kind of path. I'm not sure if that's what was happening for people, but that was the impetus, was to kind of try and demonstrate, something twofold happening, which one then has to kind of navigate. And of course, within the if one was to talk about the questions of the Black Atlantic and double consciousness being very much one of the kind of narratives that unfold. I was also really very interested in the language, the technical language used around paint and substrates, and because that's basically what the stuff of these paintings have to consider. So I was kind of, I wasn't sure how easy or difficult it would be because I couldn't do the speaking and the reading at the same time. So I wasn't sure how difficult, it was an experiment, how difficult that would be for an audience to kind of negotiate.
I think that's a really good point to kind of carry through in our discussion, this idea of double consciousness, of the doubling, and to maybe link it to what Ellen was saying about return. I loved the reference you made to geographies. We take our geographies with us and that they live within us. But then also this idea of an inability to return. I'm wondering if we can, and then of course I was thinking, about Césaire and this idea of a return to a native land. And if we could think about the return as not so much of going back, but as kind of repositioning or rethinking. If you could talk maybe a little bit more about your ideas of this return.
I think for me it's about the idea, maybe it has to do with also with about a kind of archaeology and maybe an archaeology of the sea as well, that nothing stays buried forever. So there's that kind of return, right? There's this idea of surfacing. And for me, that's certainly an interesting part of why I'm interested in painting. I mean, there's so much about surfacing and uncovering, and and obliterating. And that idea of the impossibility of return, to me, I think has to do with, I think it has to do with an idea of irretrievable loss, that there are just some, losses that are you just are never going to get back. And they are, at the bottom of the river, as Jamaica Kincaid would say, or, they are, but they're still present. That's sort of, as I've gotten older, that's something that I find that lives with me. This idea of presence and absence is a kind of simultaneous thing. And so, in a sense, the water ecstatic work that I showed in process is in a way about this kind of idea of zombie, which, is I think, an African construct, right? This return from the dead, this half-life or other life. So these ideas really interest me. I mean, it's not just George Romero that invented the zombie. It's, it's older than that. So, so that this is really a black concept in some ways. It's, of course, in Haiti. I was thinking about that, these incredible paintings. So I guess for me, the idea of the impossibility to I like what you say about positioning, that it's about, or relational. I mean, I think when I was thinking about Capsule On, this idea of like relational space within Rotterdam, I mean, this is something that's specifically happening between black and brown bodies. And so it's not the feeling that, I don't think if just anybody walked into a shawarma shop and started, this is about a relationship between these men, a standing, ongoing relationship, so that kind of porosity is about, it's not universal, it's about a real relationship. In a certain time, they can have this porosity that I find so greatly moving, which maybe is not available in all aspects of life in Rotterdam, if you're a person of color, or in the Netherlands, or in America.
The second question I wanted to ask, and I'll give you a bit of advance warning, because my third question, I'm going to steal Mark's tactic before about asking if either of you two have a question for each other. But before I get there, I wanted to go back to Sonia's reference to Turner and the slave ship. And I thought that was an interesting reference to bring up. It was something that I thought was going to come up in an earlier discussion this morning, and somehow that specific reference didn't. But I think it's Krista Thompson who brings out the fact that in Paul Gilroy's The Black Atlantic, that is the only painting that he really kind of talks about in any kind of depth. But to go back to this notion of painting and the very specific relationship that painting has to modernism. And that, I think in this exhibition, which is so much about painting and the materiality of painting, this is an opportunity to kind of go back and look at what it is about painting that allows it to speak to us in that way. And this is to both of you.
Wow. Let me just think. I mean, one of the things about thinking about Frank's work is that he's making a plea, actually, I think, that we take the work on the terms that he's working in. And he actually employs a lot of different styles, you could say, particularly the later paintings. Yet, how do we actually talk about the things themselves? How do the things themselves tell us what it is that's going on, what it is that he's invoking? I suppose that's why at the end of, and I'm still not fully sure, because I was writing this during the lunch break as well. The question about Greenberg, because of course, he had all these conversations with Greenberg. and if one, just from my own particular training, Greenbergian theory seemed to be, what's the word, so kind of caught up with materiality that it couldn't talk about other things. Mm-hmm. Yet there's this collapsing of these other things that are in the work that you cannot avoid somehow. Frank doesn't allow us to avoid them. So either one talks about the kind of social and political space, or one talks about painting, and somehow in those works those things collide. Mm-hmm. Collide in the way that he makes, in the processes that he employs, I feel that actually in the works, the later works, he undoes what he's been taught in some ways, that somehow he can bring these more symbolic references into the language of painting, mm-hmm. in a way that he maybe couldn't have at the end of the 60s and into the 70s, that he couldn't have necessarily. And I think that's why the map begins to loosen from as a kind of iconic sign in the work, that actually he's found another way. He's found another way through the processes of all these different painterly languages to say, it's in there, it's buried, it's all of what I'm talking about is buried in this materiality. I don't know if I've said I'm not sure if I've answered what you were just asking me, but I'm mm-hmm. trying to think through, mm-hmm. How he manages to speak both about this kind of deep history and about the medium of painting, both at the same time. Did I answer what you...
You did.
I've probably gone off.
No.
I like very much what you were saying about this burial, because I think in some ways, I was thinking earlier when we were thinking about his anger or competition with Barnett Newman, I think it was a disappointment. I don't know Frank Bowling, but I think because Barnett Newman is known as such a great writer of other artists, and this idea of this universal or, self-evident abstraction, that's not what they were talking about. Rothko, this is very specific. That seabed is very specific. Mm-hmm. And the Vesuvius man of Barnett Newman, that vertical being. I think there's a reason that Frank Bowling places the map of South America on, that zip, like right on it, like here's this. Because if that zip, I think he's placing this kind of concrete matter, into this discourse. And I don't think it maybe it didn't get picked up enough for him, and so there's a real disappointment and a betrayal. I think that maybe it is just competitive. I don't know. I don't know his nature, but just for me as an artist, you do sometimes feel like, oh, I didn't mean for that to be buried, but in this context, apparently it is. So there's also that. So there's this willful burying that we do as artists, and this sort of paucities in mm-hmm. our work. But there's also the fact that that's also imposed upon us in some ways. That refusal to read the work, or that refusal to have a subject position with the work, to have a porous relationship to the work of the viewer, because it's not universal.
Thank you, Sonia. It was a great pleasure to share this with you.
Yeah.